Nolan Pierce only wanted 10 quiet minutes, one bitter cup of coffee, and enough courage to figure out how he would keep the heat on for his little girl. Outside, rain hammered the foggy windows of the cheap cafe. Inside, his 7-year-old daughter Marin was coloring a blue dog, completely unaware that their lives were about to be dragged into a world of money secrets and grief. Then an old woman in a tailored wool coat appeared beside their table, her hand clamped around Nolan's wrist, cold and trembling. Before he could pull away, she leaned close and whispered, "Pretend you're my daughter's fiancé." Nolan thought she was confused, maybe dangerous, maybe just another rich stranger treating him like a tool. But when the cafe door opened, every sound in the room seemed to die. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped inside, untouched by the storm, her presence so sharp even the barista froze. Celeste Veyne, Billionaire CEO, scanned the room like she owned the air itself. The old woman tightened her grip and smiled with desperate pride. "There he is," she said, "my future son-in-law." Nolan's blood ran cold. Celeste's eyes moved over his grease-stained hands, worn boots, and exhausted face with open disgust. He could tell the truth. He could walk away. But the old woman's hand was shaking like her whole life depended on this lie, and his daughter was watching him with wide, confused eyes. So Nolan forced a smile, looked straight at the most powerful woman in the city, and said, "Nice to finally meet you." But why did this grieving old woman choose a broke single father? And what dead secret was she trying to bring back to life? Nolan Pierce hated the sound of rain when he had no money. To other people, rain was background noise, something romantic against a window, something soft enough to drink coffee beside. To Nolan, it meant wet socks for his daughter, another leak in the apartment ceiling, fewer customers at the garage, and a heating bill that would still be waiting for him on Friday, no matter how hard the sky came down. He sat hunched over a small wooden table in a cheap cafe on Calder Street, one hand wrapped around a paper-thin mug of bitter coffee, the other rubbing the bridge of his nose as if pressure alone could hold his life together. Across from him, his 7-year-old daughter Marin was carefully destroying a blueberry muffin and coloring a dog blue, because, as she had explained twice, the brown crayon was too tired to work. Crumbs clung to her chin, her pink sneakers scuffed at the toes, and too tight by half a size, swung beneath the chair. Nolan noticed the way she curled her toes whenever she thought he was not looking, and every time she did, guilt tightened in his chest like a wrench around a rusted bolt. He had promised himself he would buy her new boots before the cold got worse, but promises were easy when made in the dark before sleep, and almost impossible when rent, groceries, garage debt, and winter heat all stood in line with open hands. The cafe smelled of burned milk, damp wool, cheap sugar, and old wood. The table wobbled whenever he breathed too heavily. He had only bought one coffee for himself and one muffin for Marin, and even that small indulgence felt reckless. He was supposed to be at the garage, but Owen could cover the front for 30 minutes, and Nolan had needed a place where Marin could sit warm while he tried to figure out which bill could be ignored without turning into a disaster. That was when Marin stopped humming. "Dad," she whispered, leaning forward with the grave seriousness of a child delivering dangerous information. "That lady keeps looking at us." Nolan did not turn immediately. He had learned that some problems disappeared if you refused to look at them. "Eat your muffin, bug," he muttered. "Don't stare at people." "I'm not staring," Marin said. "She is." Nolan sighed and glanced over his shoulder. 2 tables away sat an elderly woman who looked as if she had been misplaced from a private estate and dropped into the wrong corner of the city. Her coat was tailored wool the color of wet stone. A silk scarf was tied neatly around her throat. Her silver hair was pinned with the kind of precision that required either wealth or discipline, and her gloved hands rested on the polished handle of a dark wooden cane. But her eyes were what made Nolan uneasy, pale, blue, watery, and fixed on him with a focus that did not match her frail body. She was not watching him casually, she was studying him, measuring him, deciding something about him. Nolan looked away first. He hated being examined by people with money. He knew that look. He had seen it from customers who asked if the owner was available while standing right in front of him. He had seen it from landlords who noticed the grease under his nails before they noticed the rent money in his hand. He had seen it from men in suits who assumed a mechanic's silence meant stupidity. He shifted in his chair and the table rocked hard enough to spill coffee over the rim. "Great," he muttered, grabbing a napkin too thin to help. When he looked up again, the old woman was standing beside him. Nolan jerked back his chair, scraping the floor. He had not heard her approach over the hiss of the espresso machine and the dull acoustic music playing from the ceiling. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender cold air and expensive paper. Her face was lined but proud, her mouth drawn tight, her breathing uneven. "Can I help you?" Nolan asked, sharper than he meant to. His hand moved instinctively toward Marin, not touching her, just placing himself between his daughter and the stranger. The woman did not answer. Her gaze moved from his faded flannel shirt to the grease that never fully left his knuckles, then to Marin's coloring book, then back to Nolan's face. It was not disgust. It was calculation mixed with panic. Before Nolan could stand, her thin hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Her fingers were shockingly cold. "Hey," Nolan snapped, trying to pull free without frightening Marin. "Lady, let go." The woman leaned down and her voice came out in a dry, urgent whisper. "Pretend you are my daughter's fiancé." Nolan stared at her. For one frozen second, his exhausted mind refused to translate the words into meaning. "What?" "Smile," she whispered, grip tightening. "Nod. Act as if you belong to her. Please." "I don't know you," Nolan said. "I don't know your daughter, and I don't want whatever this is." "She is coming," the old woman said, eyes flicking toward the front door. The panic in her face deepened so suddenly that Nolan's anger faltered. "God help me, she is coming inside." The bell above the cafe door chimed. The room changed before Nolan even looked. The barista stopped moving. A pair of students in the corner lowered their voices. The air seemed to tighten. A woman stepped in from the rain, though no rain appeared to have touched her. She wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, black heels that struck the floor in slow, exact clicks, and a face so controlled it seemed carved rather than made. Her dark hair was pinned back in a severe knot. Her eyes swept the cafe once cold and efficient and landed on the old woman standing beside Nolan's table. Nolan recognized her the way anyone in the city would. Celeste Veyne, CEO of Veyne Dominion, the woman who bought buildings, closed factories, shook hands with mayors, and appeared on business magazines with headlines about discipline, power, and impossible growth. She walked toward them with the calm of someone who had never once needed to ask permission. Mother Celeste said, her voice smooth and empty of warmth. "You slipped your security detail again. Do you understand the liability you have created?" The old woman's spine straightened. Her hand, still gripping Nolan's wrist, trembled once and then steadied. "I am not a child, Celeste," she said. "I was having tea with my future son-in-law." Silence fell so hard Nolan could hear the rain ticking against the glass. Marin's mouth opened, a piece of muffin resting forgotten between her fingers. Celeste stopped. Her eyes moved to Nolan. He felt them take inventory. Cheap shirt, work boots, tired face, grease-stained hands, discount watch, child at the table, spilled coffee, unpaid life. Her expression barely shifted, but contempt could be quiet and still cut deep. Nolan knew he should end it immediately. He should say, "Your mother is confused. I have nothing to do with this. Take her home." Instead, the old woman's fingers slid from his wrist to his sleeve, clutching him with a desperation that did not feel like manipulation. It felt like drowning. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" she asked. "This," the old woman said, lifting her chin, "is the man your sister should have brought home long ago." Nolan's stomach dropped. Sister. He had not known Celeste Veyne had one. He opened his mouth, but Celeste's gaze sharpened, daring him to speak, daring him to prove he was nothing. Something hot and ugly sparked inside him, born from debt, exhaustion, humiliation, and too many years of swallowing insults because rent was due. He wiped his hand on his jeans, forced the worst smile of his life, and said, "Nice to finally meet you, Celeste." The cafe went completely still. Celeste did not offer her hand. "You are claiming to be engaged to my sister?" she asked. "That's the general idea," Nolan said, though every instinct in his body screamed that he had just stepped off a roof. Celeste's mouth curved slightly, not into a smile, but into the beginning of a dissection. She pulled out the empty chair beside him and rested her manicured fingers on its back. "Fascinating," she said, "because my sister has not lived in this country for years." The old woman gave a brittle laugh. "You always believe what your people tell you?" Nolan felt sweat gather under his collar. He needed a story, any story, before Celeste cut through him in front of everyone. His eyes dropped to Marin's coloring book, then to the rain on the window, then to his own hands. "Her car broke down," he said, "out by the interstate. Alternator failed. I showed up with the tow truck, got her back to my garage, gave her bad coffee, and we talked." It sounded ridiculous, but he held Celeste's gaze because pride was the only thing he had left that cost nothing. Marin suddenly turned her coloring book around. "I made the dog blue," she announced to Celeste. "Are you the aunt?" Nolan nearly choked. Two people near the counter had already lifted their phones, pretending not to record. Celeste noticed. Her face hardened. Public scandal had entered the room, and Nolan saw the exact moment she decided money would be faster than truth. She leaned closer, her perfume cold and expensive. "You will walk my mother to the black SUV outside," she said quietly. "You will bring your daughter. You will smile. You will not speak to anyone." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Celeste removed a slim checkbook from her coat and placed it on the wet table beside his spilled coffee. "I am going to write a number large enough to make this unpleasant little performance worth your time," she said. Nolan wanted to throw the coffee in her face. Then he looked at Marin's tight shoes, the blue dog, the muffin crumbs, the little girl who trusted him to make the world work somehow. His pride fought hard, but hunger and winter fought harder. He looked back at Celeste, voice flat with shame and anger. "Make it a cashier's check." The inside of Celeste Veyne's SUV felt less like a car and more like a sealed room designed to keep ordinary life out. The moment the heavy door shut, the noise of the rain, the cheap cafe, the watching phones, and the wet street vanished behind layers of glass, leather, and money. Nolan sat stiffly opposite Celeste, one arm wrapped protectively around Marin, who had gone silent for the first time all afternoon. His daughter's wide eyes moved over the glowing blue lights in the ceiling, the polished drink cabinet, the soft leather seats, and the small silver buttons she clearly wanted to touch but knew better than to ask about. Rosalind sat in the far back as if she owned the air around her, again her frailty from the cafe replaced by a strange, brittle satisfaction. She smiled at Marin and asked if blue dogs were common now, and Marin, after glancing nervously at Nolan, whispered that they were rare but very friendly. Celeste did not smile. She did not even look at them at first. She opened a tablet, tapped something with quick, sharp movements, and spoke into the silence as if dictating an order to invisible staff. No statements, no confirmations. Anyone who filmed in the cafe is to be contacted before the clip spreads. Pay whatever is necessary, but quietly. Nolan's jaw tightened. Of course. That was how people like her handled storms. They did not get wet. They hired someone to move the rain. "How much trouble am I in?" he asked. Celeste finally lowered the tablet. "Legally, none yet. Morally, that depends on how often you make a habit of taking advantage of sick old women." Nolan felt the words hit harder than he expected. "She grabbed me," he said. "She asked me to help." "And you agreed," Celeste replied. Her eyes dropped to his work boots. "For money. I agreed before you opened that checkbook." Convenient distinction. "I agreed because she looked terrified," Nolan snapped, his voice low so Marin would not fully understand. The money just made dealing with you slightly less insulting. For the first time, Celeste's composure flickered. It was small, almost nothing, just a pause of her fingers against the edge of the tablet, but Nolan saw it. Beneath the expensive coat and perfect posture, she was tired. Not irritated, not embarrassed. Tired in a way Nolan recognized from his own bathroom mirror at 5 in the morning, when he washed grease off his arms and tried to convince himself another 16-hour day would be enough. Celeste looked past him toward the rain running over the tinted window. "My mother has early-stage vascular dementia," she said. The words came out clean and controlled, but there was something hollow under them. "Some days she understands exactly who I am, where she is, what year it is. Other days, she lives inside unfinished moments. She believes she is fixing mistakes that cannot be fixed." Nolan's anger began to loosen, not disappear, but shift into something heavier. "The sister she mentioned," he said carefully, "is she real?" Celeste's eyes did not move from the window. Aveline was real. Was. The word filled the Suve colder than the air conditioning. Marin leaned her head against Nolan's side, suddenly sleepy now that the fear had softened into confusion. Rosalind was humming in the back, helping Marin's blue dog acquire an imaginary hat. Celeste's voice lowered. Aveline died 3 years ago. A car accident on the interstate during a storm. She was driving too fast. She always drove too fast. Nolan said nothing. He could feel the story coming before she finished it, and some part of him did not want to hear it. "A mechanic pulled her from the wreck before the car caught fire," Celeste continued. "He was not able to save her, but he stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. He held her hand while she died." Nolan looked down at his own hands, scarred, rough, permanently stained in the lines no soap could reach. In Rosalind's broken memory, hands like his had become the last bridge between a daughter and the dark. "Your mother thinks I'm him," he said. "No," Celeste replied. "She thinks you are what came after him. She thinks if she can make the mechanic into Aveline's fiancé, then the accident becomes a rescue. The rescue becomes a romance, and the death disappears." The SUV rolled through the city, passing towers of glass and wet sidewalks crowded with people who would never know that inside this perfect black vehicle, a billionaire family was being held together by a lie, and a broke mechanic with rainwater drying on his sleeves. Celeste reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick cream envelope. She placed it on the seat between them. $10,000, she said. "For your time today, your silence tomorrow, and your absence from my family forever." Nolan stared at the envelope. $10,000. His mind betrayed him instantly. 6 months of garage rent, the heating bill, groceries that did not come from discount shelves, new boots for Marin, maybe even enough to fix the apartment window that whistled all night when the wind came off the river. It was not just money, it was oxygen, it was sleep. It was 1 month, maybe 2, without waking in a panic. "I'm not a blackmailer," he said, though the word sounded weak even to him. "I did not say you were," Celeste answered. "I am paying for a service rendered." He looked at her, then really looked and saw something that made the money feel uglier. Celeste was not only trying to buy his silence, she was trying to buy distance from the one thing her power could not control. Grief had entered her house and refused to leave, and all her wealth could do was build thicker walls around it. Nolan took the envelope because his daughter needed heat more than his pride needed victory. But the moment his fingers closed around it, shame spread through him like oil in clean water. "I'm sorry," he muttered, not sure whether he meant for Aveline, for Rosalind, for Celeste, or for himself. Celeste lifted the tablet again. "Don't be. You got paid. That is what matters in the end." The SUV dropped them outside Calder Street Garage 20 minutes later. Before Nolan could step out, Rosalind caught his jacket sleeve. The force in her hand was gone now. She looked smaller, sunken into the leather seat, her eyes clouded and frightened. "Take care of her," she whispered. "She drives too fast. Tell her to slow down." Nolan's throat tightened. Celeste stared straight ahead, jaw locked, refusing to watch her mother beg a stranger to protect a dead daughter. Nolan could have stayed silent. Instead, he bent slightly and said, "I will. I'll make sure she slows down." Rosalind nodded, relieved by a promise that could never be kept, and let him go. Inside the garage, the familiar smell of motor oil and cold concrete hit Nolan like punishment and home at the same time. Owen was hammering a brake rotor in the second bay, but Nolan walked straight into his cramped office, sat Marin at the desk with her coloring book, and opened the envelope with hands that did not feel like his own. The cash was crisp, clean, and wrong. He counted it once, then shoved it into the bottom drawer and locked it away. That night, he paid the heating bill. He bought groceries with fresh fruit instead of cheap noodles. He took Marin to the mall and bought her the pink boots with fake fur she had been pretending not to want for weeks. She squealed when she tried them on, and Nolan smiled because he loved her too much not to smile, but the sound of those boots squeaking across the apartment floor became a tiny accusation. Every warm room, every full plate, every happy step reminded him of Rosalind's cold fingers and Celeste's empty eyes. For 3 days, Nolan tried to convince himself he had done what any father would do. A man with a child did not get to be pure. He got to survive. But survival did not silence guilt. On Thursday morning, while he was under a rusted Honda fighting a frozen suspension bolt, a shadow fell across the garage floor. Nolan. He rolled out on the creeper and saw Celeste standing in the middle of the bay, expensive heels planted in a dark stain of transmission fluid. She looked different. Her hair was no longer perfect. Her face was pale. Her eyes were bruised with sleeplessness. "I thought we had a transaction," Nolan said coldly. "I thought I was never supposed to see you again." Celeste swallowed. "My mother stopped eating on Tuesday. She will not take her medication. She sits in the dark and says your name." Nolan sat up slowly. "No." The word came out before she could ask. "I can't keep doing this. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a ghost you can rent whenever your family falls apart." "I know," Celeste said, and the crack in her voice startled them both. "It is cruel. It is humiliating. It is impossible. But she is terrified, and right now the lie you hate is the only thing that makes her feel safe." Nolan wanted to stay angry. It would have been easier. But then Celeste said, almost in a whisper, "I can buy nearly anything in this city, Nolan, but I cannot buy one spoonful of food into my mother's mouth." That was the moment something in Nolan changed. He no longer saw a billionaire ordering a poor man around. He saw a daughter standing in grease and cold concrete begging because love had finally dragged her somewhere money could not protect her. He thought of Marin. He thought of what he would hope the world might offer her if she ever had to beg for him. Slowly, Nolan stood. He threw the shop rag onto the workbench and called over his shoulder, "Owen, watch the front. I have to step out." Celeste closed her eyes for half a second as if the smallest mercy had nearly broken her. Nolan grabbed his jacket, still angry, still ashamed, but no longer thinking about the money. This time he was not going because he had been bought. He was going because somewhere inside a mansion full of wealth, an old woman was starving in the dark, waiting for a mechanic to bring back the only version of the truth her broken heart could survive. The drive to the Veyne estate was quieter than Nolan expected. Celeste did not make calls, did not open her tablet, did not throw instructions into the air like the world existed to catch them. She drove herself this time, both hands tight on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the wet road ahead as if the city might split open beneath them if she looked away for even a second. Nolan sat in the passenger seat with his jacket half-zipped, the smell of motor oil clinging to him no matter how much he had wiped his hands before leaving the garage. In the cafe and the SUV, Celeste's wealth had felt like a weapon pointed at him. Now, inside her silent car, it felt more like armor that had become too heavy to wear. They passed from crowded streets into older neighborhoods, then through iron gates taller than Nolan's apartment building. The estate appeared beyond a curtain of bare trees, a massive stone house perched above the river. Elegant, enormous, and so lifeless it looked less like a home than a monument built for people who had forgotten how to sit close to one another. The gardens were perfect, the driveway swept clean, the windows shining even under the gray morning sky, but Nolan felt no warmth from any of it. "She lives here alone?" he asked before he could stop himself. Celeste parked near the front steps and killed the engine. "With nurses, staff security specialists, people whose names she remembers less each week," she said. "So yes, alone." Nolan looked at her then, and for once, she did not hide the pain quickly enough. It crossed her face raw and brief before she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood, old flowers, and money preserved too carefully. A housekeeper appeared and vanished after Celeste gave a slight shake of her head. No one spoke. Their footsteps moved across marble, up a sweeping staircase, and down a long corridor where portraits watched from gilded frames. Nolan recognized Celeste in some of them as a younger woman, severe even then. Beside her in one portrait stood another woman with a softer face, laughing at something outside the frame. Aveline. Nolan slowed without meaning to. Celeste noticed. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make her into a saint just because she died." "I wasn't," Nolan said. "I was just thinking she looked happy." Celeste's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. At the end of the corridor, two nurses stood outside a set of double doors. One held a tray with untouched soup and tea. The other looked relieved when Celeste arrived, but suspicious when she saw Nolan. "She still refuses?" Celeste asked. The older nurse nodded. She asked for him again. "But Ms. Veyne, before he goes in, I need to say this is not clinically advisable. Reinforcing a delusion can increase dependency and agitation. If he leaves again, she may decline further." Nolan felt the warning settle heavily between them. Celeste looked at him, not commanding now, not buying, only asking with eyes she clearly hated needing. Nolan exhaled. "I'm not going in there to pretend I'm marrying your dead sister," he said. "If that's what you need, find an actor." The nurse blinked. Celeste's face went still. "Then why did you come?" she asked. "Because your mother doesn't need a fiancé," Nolan said. "She needs someone to tell her she isn't being abandoned." He took the tray from the nurse before anyone could object and pushed open the door. The bedroom was dark despite the morning, the curtains drawn tight, the air thick with medicine, stale perfume, and roses beginning to rot in a vase by the window. Rosalind sat in a high-backed chair near the cold fireplace, wrapped in a pale blanket, her hair loose around her face in silver wisps. She looked smaller than she had in the cafe, as if grief had eaten through the parts of her that posture and silk had once protected. Nolan did not turn on the lights. He did not announce himself like a visitor in a museum. He walked across the carpet with the steady weight of his work boots and set the tray on the side table. Rosalind's eyes moved slowly toward the sound. For a moment there was no recognition. Then her face crumpled. "You came back," she whispered. Nolan lowered himself into the chair across from her instead of kneeling because he did not want to perform reverence. He wanted to offer presence. "I said I would check on you," he answered. "You need to eat something." Rosalind stared at him, searching his face for the shape of a memory. "Where is Aveline?" The question was soft enough to break bones. Nolan heard a tiny movement behind him and knew Celeste had remained outside the half-open door. He chose each word with care. "She isn't here," he said. Rosalind's fingers trembled against the blanket. "Because Celeste sent her away." Nolan looked down at the soup. "No, because some roads only go one direction, and some people we love can't come back from them." The room seemed to tighten. Rosalind's eyes sharpened suddenly, painfully. "You speak like a poor man," she said. "Poor men think loss is weather. They let it happen." Nolan almost smiled at the insult, not because it was funny, but because there was life in it. "Poor men don't let loss happen," he said. "We just can't afford to rename it." For the first time, Rosalind looked directly at him, not through him. "What is your daughter's name?" she asked. The shift was so sudden Nolan almost did not answer. Marin, the child with the blue dog. That's her. Rosalind's lips trembled into the faintest smile. Aveline drew horses with too many legs. 6, sometimes 8. She said 4 looked lonely. O pinned up the spoon and held it out, not like a nurse feeding a patient, but like a stubborn man negotiating with another stubborn person. 1 spoonful, he said. Then you can tell me about the horses. Rosalind glared at him. You are very rude. I've been told. And dirty. Usually worse by lunchtime. Something flickered in her face, almost amusement, almost memory. She took the spoon. Her hand shook badly and some soup spilled onto the blanket, but she swallowed. It was 1 spoonful, barely anything, but Celeste made a sound outside the door as if she had been struck. Nolan did not look back. He let Rosalind speak. She told him about Aveline hiding stray cats in the greenhouse, about Celeste organizing her dolls by height and importance, about the summer both girls painted the east fountain red and blamed a gardener who had been dead for 2 years. The more Rosalind talked, the more she ate. Not much, but enough for color to return faintly to her lips. Nolan listened, and in listening he began to understand the shape of the family's wound. Celeste had survived by becoming control itself. Rosalind had survived by breaking reality into pieces small enough to hold. Then, just as Nolan thought the worst had passed, Rosalind's hand shot out and caught his wrist again. Her eyes were no longer cloudy. They were clear, terrified, and full of accusation. You must not let Celeste drive, she whispered. She was angry that night. She called Aveline again and again. She told her to come home. She made her drive through the storm. Nolan froze. Behind him, the door opened fully. Celeste stood in the hallway, white-faced. Mother, she said, but her voice was no longer cold. It was the voice of someone hearing a verdict. Rosalind looked past Nolan and pointed a shaking finger at her daughter. You said if she did not come back, she was no longer family. Celeste flinched as if slapped. Nolan slowly stood, suddenly aware that he had walked into something far deeper than dementia, deeper than grief. This was guilt with a pulse. Is that true? He asked Celeste. For a long moment she could not answer. The nurse stepped forward, alarmed by Rosalind's rising breath, but Rosalind shoved weakly at the blanket, trying to stand. She was crying, Rosalind said. My Aveline was crying when she left him, when she drove, when the rain came. Celeste gripped the doorframe. Her perfect hands looked fragile now. I called her, she said, each word scraped out of her. We fought. I told her to stop running from the family, stop embarrassing us, stop making me clean up what she broke. I told her to come home. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. I didn't know she would drive into the storm. The room erupted quietly, the nurse trying to calm Rosalind. Rosalind sobbing Aveline's name, Celeste standing as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. Nolan could have left. This was not his family, not his guilt, not his mansion full of ghosts. But Rosalind was gasping, Celeste was frozen, and the entire house seemed to be waiting for someone poor enough, ordinary enough, human enough to do what money had failed to do. Nolan stepped between mother and daughter, not as a hired liar now, not as a mechanic playing a role, but as a father who understood that pain, when cornered, could turn savage. Enough, he said, firm but not loud. No one is healing anything like this. Celeste looked at him, stunned that he would speak to her that way in her own house. Rosalind trembled in her chair. Nolan turned to the old woman first. Eat 2 more spoonfuls, he said. Then I will stay long enough for you to rest. And her Rosalind whispered, glaring at Celeste. Nolan looked back at the CEO, whose power had finally failed completely. She stays too, he said, but she listens. No orders, no money, no running. Celeste's chin shook once. Then slowly she stepped into the room and sat on the edge of a chair like a child called to account. Nolan handed Rosalind the spoon again. This was not the solution he had expected. It was messier, uglier, and more dangerous. But for the first time, everyone was in the same room with the truth, and Nolan understood that solving this conflict would not mean protecting Rosalind from pain. It would mean helping all of them survive hearing it. For several minutes after Celeste sat down, no one in Rosalind Veyne's dark bedroom seemed to know how to breathe without hurting someone else. The old woman held the spoon in one trembling hand and stared at her daughter as if Celeste were both the child she had raised and the stranger who had ruined everything. Celeste sat on the edge of the chair with her back too straight, her hands locked together in her lap, every instinct in her body fighting the humiliation of being witnessed like this by a mechanic from Calder Street. Nolan stood between them, feeling the weight of the room press against his ribs. He was not trained for this. He fixed engines, replaced brake lines, fought rusted bolts, and negotiated payment plans with customers who cried beside broken cars, because one repair bill could destroy a month. He did not know how to repair a family that had wrapped grief around itself for 3 years, until grief became its only language. But he knew what happened when pressure built in a system with nowhere to go. Something burst. So he did the only thing he understood. He released pressure slowly. "No one talks until she eats," he said. Celeste's eyes lifted sharply, offended by the command. Rosalind's mouth tightened with the old aristocratic stubbornness that had not left her even as memory slipped away. Nolan did not soften. "2 spoonfuls," he said. "Then you can both say whatever you need to say without pretending you're not bleeding." Rosalind looked at him for a long time. Then, with visible effort, she raised the spoon to her lips and swallowed. The nurse at the doorway exhaled. Celeste looked down as if the sight was too much mercy to bear. Nolan waited until Rosalind took another spoonful before he moved the tray a little closer and stepped back. Now he said quietly, "Not accusations, not speeches, one truth at a time." Celeste let out a humorless laugh so fragile it almost broke before becoming sound. "You speak as if truth is clean." "It isn't," Nolan said. "That's why people avoid it." Rosalind's gaze drifted toward the cold fireplace. "She was crying," she whispered. "My Aveline was crying because you made everything a war." Celeste closed her eyes. Nolan expected her to defend herself, to turn cold again, to reach for that clean executive voice that made every emotion sound like a legal liability. Instead, she opened her eyes and looked directly at her mother. "Yes," she said. The words stunned the room. Rosalind's fingers went still. Celeste swallowed, and Nolan saw the first real crack become a doorway. "I made everything a war," Celeste continued, "because after Father died, everyone looked at me as if I had to hold the company, the house, the name, and all of you in both hands without dropping anything." Aveline hated it. She said I turned love into management. She was right. Rosalind's face crumpled, but she did not look away. Celeste's voice shook harder. "That night I called her because I was angry. I wanted her to come home. I wanted her to stop running from the family, stop making headlines, stop leaving me to explain her life to people who only cared about our stock price. I said cruel things. I told her if she kept choosing strangers over us, she should not expect us to keep choosing her." The confession sat in the air like smoke. Nolan felt his own throat tighten. He had been angry at Celeste because it was easy to hate someone who used money like armor. It was harder to hate her when she sat there stripped down to guilt and memory, finally admitting that control had been her way of being terrified. Rosalind's lips parted. "You sent her into the storm." Celeste flinched, but she did not run from it. "I called her into it," she said. "I did not know it would be the last thing I ever asked of her. But I have heard my own voice in my head every day since. I have punished everyone in this house because I could not punish the person who made that call." The nurse wiped her eyes silently. Nolan turned his face toward the curtained window, giving Celeste the dignity of not being stared at while she fell apart. Rosalind began to cry, not with the wild panic from before, but with a quieter grief that seemed to come from somewhere older than words. Nolan moved to leave, thinking perhaps this was finally a moment that belonged only to mother and daughter, but Rosalind caught his sleeve. "Do not go." He looked at Celeste, waiting for the old objection, the suspicion, the command to take payment and disappear. It never came. Celeste only nodded once, exhausted and small. So Nolan stayed. He stayed while Rosalind asked the same question 3 different ways. He stayed while Celeste answered each time without snapping, without correcting her mother like a failed report, without pretending the repetition did not hurt. He stayed until the soup was half gone, and the first gray light of late afternoon thinned around the edges of the curtains. At some point, Rosalind reached for Celeste's hand and missed. Celeste saw it and froze as if accepting touch after years of armor required more courage than running an empire. Nolan did not speak. He simply tilted his head toward her mother. Celeste moved her hand. Rosalind's fingers closed around it weakly. "You were always too hard," Rosalind whispered. Celeste's face folded. "I know, because I taught you to be." Celeste looked up. Rosalind's eyes were cloudy again, but something true remained behind them. "I taught you daughters must become walls. I forgot walls cannot hold children." Celeste pressed her free hand over her mouth, but a sob escaped anyway. Nolan stepped back then because the room had begun to heal in a way he was not meant to own. He had not repaired them. He had only refused to let them keep bleeding in separate rooms. When Rosalind finally slept, her hand still resting against Celeste's, Nolan walked out into the hallway. His legs ached. His shirt smelled of soup roses, old medicine, and motor oil. Celeste followed him a few minutes later, closing the door softly behind her. For the first time since he had met her, she did not stand like someone above him. She stood like someone beside a cliff. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Nolan leaned against the wall, too tired to be impressed by honesty, but not too tired to respect it. "Start by not buying your way out of every feeling." A faint, broken, almost smile touched her mouth. "That is the rudest advice I have ever paid nothing for." "Then it's probably worth keeping." The almost smile vanished as quickly as it came. "I owe you an apology." Nolan looked at her. "You owe a lot of people apologies." "I know," she said, and this time there was no defense in it. "But I am starting with you. I treated you as if your poverty made you available, as if your need gave me permission. I saw your daughter's shoes and used them against you before I even knew her name." Nolan wanted to tell her it did not matter because accepting apologies made him uncomfortable, and because part of him still wanted to keep the clean anger he had carried into the house. But the truth was, it did matter. Her apology did not erase the humiliation, but it named it, and naming a wound was the first step toward not pretending it was normal. "Her name is Marin," he said. Celeste nodded. "Marin." Olena looked toward the staircase, suddenly remembering the garage, the jobs waiting, Owen alone at the front, the customers he could not afford to lose. His life had not paused just because the Veyne family's grief had opened under his feet. "I need to go," he said. "I can have a driver take you. I'll call a cab." "Nolan." Her voice stopped him, not because it commanded, but because it asked. He turned. Celeste reached into her coat pocket, then hesitated, hand frozen before it could become a transaction. Slowly, she withdrew nothing. "Thank you," she said instead. Nolan nodded once. "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow she may forget this and hate you again. Or need me again. Or need someone better than me. Will you come back if she asks?" The question carried no checkbook, no threat, no arrogance. That made it harder. Nolan thought of Marin's boots, of the money locked in his drawer, of the shame that still lived under his ribs. He thought of Rosalind eating because someone had stayed, and of Celeste finally sitting still long enough to be a daughter. "I won't be rented," he said. "Not again." Celeste's eyes lowered. "I understand. But if you call because she needs help, I'll answer if I can." Something like relief passed through her, quiet and painful. When Nolan returned to the garage, Owen was angry 2 customers had left, and a delivery invoice lay unpaid on his desk. The consequences were waiting exactly where he had left them. That night, Marin asked why the rich lady had come back. Nolan sat beside her bed listening to the radiator hiss because of money he was still ashamed of taking. "Because her mom was scared," he said. Marin thought about that. "Did you fix her?" Nolan brushed a curl from his daughter's forehead. "No bug. People aren't cars. You don't fix them all at once." "Then what did you do?" He looked at her pink boots by the door, then at his grease-darkened hands. I stayed until they could start fixing each other. Marin accepted this with the solemn wisdom of children and closed her eyes. Nolan sat there long after she slept, understanding that something in him had changed too. He had entered the lie as a desperate father taking money. He had returned as a man choosing mercy without surrendering his dignity. And somewhere across the city, in a mansion that no longer felt quite as dead, a mother and daughter had begun the painful work of speaking to each other without hiding behind ghosts. By morning, Nolan tried to return to the shape of his old life, but the old life no longer fit him cleanly. The garage still smelled of oil and metal. Owen was still annoyed about the customers who had walked out. The invoices were still stacked like accusations on his desk, and Marin still needed breakfast, school-clean socks, and someone to braid her hair, badly enough that she would laugh and redo it herself. Nothing practical had changed, and yet everything felt altered, as if Nolan had crossed a door he could not uncross. He worked through the morning under a delivery van, replacing a cracked fuel line, while his phone sat face up on the concrete beside him. He told himself he was not waiting for it to ring. He told himself the Veynes had enough doctors' nurses' money and grief to continue without him. But every time the phone vibrated from a spam call or a supplier message, his chest tightened. Near noon, the call finally came. Celeste's name appeared on the cracked screen, and for 1 second, Nolan closed his eyes because he already knew peace was over. "She's gone," Celeste said the moment he answered. There was no CEO in her voice now, no command, no polish, only terror. "My mother slipped past the nurse. Security found the east gate open. She took one of the old house cars." Nolan was already standing. "Where would she go?" "The interstate," Celeste whispered. "The road where Aveline died." Alan grabbed his jacket, shouted for Owen to take over, and drove his tow truck harder than he had driven anything in years. Celeste sent him the location while she followed in her sedan, but Nolan knew roads like that better than she did. He knew where the shoulders disappeared, where the rain collected, where old crash scars stayed hidden under new asphalt. The sky had turned iron gray, and a cold drizzle blurred the windshield. By the time he reached the abandoned service pull-off near mile marker 42, he saw the old silver car angled near the guardrail, driver's door open, hazard lights blinking weakly in the mist. Rosalind stood beyond it, close to the barrier, her silk scarf whipping in the wind, her thin body swaying as trucks roared past. Nolan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Rosalind," he called, moving slowly, palms open. She turned, and the look on her face stopped him. She was not confused in the simple way people expected old minds to be confused. She was trapped between two worlds, one where her daughter was dead, and one where a mother could still arrive in time if she hurried enough. "She was here," Rosalind cried. "Aveline was here. She called me. She said she was coming home." Celeste's car skidded to a stop behind Nolan's truck. She ran toward them, heels slipping on wet gravel. "Mother, please, step away from the rail." Rosalind recoiled at her voice. "You told her she was not family." Celeste stopped as if struck, rain streaking her face until Nolan could no longer tell what was rain and what was tears. "I did," she said, "and I have hated myself for it every day." Rosalind shook her head violently. "No, no, you made her drive. You made her cry." "I made her cry," Celeste said, voice breaking. "But I did not know she was coming home to forgive me." Nolan looked at her. Celeste reached into her coat with shaking hands and pulled out an old phone sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. "The police returned her things years ago," she said. "I could never listen. Last night after you left, I finally did." She pressed play. The speaker crackled under the rain, and then a woman's voice emerged, faint, breathless, alive from 3 years ago. "Celeste, I'm angry and you're unbearable, and I know you think I'm running again, but I'm coming home. Not because you ordered me to, because Mom sounded small on the phone, and because I'm tired of punishing you for being scared. We need to talk. Please don't turn this into another war. I love you even when I can't stand you." The message ended in a burst of static. The highway thundered around them. Celeste covered her mouth. Rosalind stared at the phone as if a ghost had placed a hand on her cheek. "She said she loved you," Nolan said gently. "She was coming back because she wanted to come back." Rosalind's knees weakened. Nolan moved before she fell, catching her carefully, feeling how light she was beneath the wool coat. Celeste reached them at the same time, and for once, Rosalind did not pull away from her daughter. She collapsed against both of them, one hand clutching Nolan's sleeve, the other buried in Celeste's coat. "I didn't say goodbye," Rosalind sobbed. "I let the house teach my girls to be hard, and I never told her she could come home soft." Celeste bent her head over her mother's shoulder. "I didn't say it either," she whispered. "I thought there would be time." Nolan held them steady beside the road, the rich mother, the powerful daughter, and the mechanic who had stumbled into their grief because an old woman mistook him for a miracle. He understood then that the truth had not destroyed Rosalind. It had wounded her, yes, but it had also opened the locked room where her real mourning had been waiting. "Listen to me," Nolan said, firm enough to cut through the wind. "Aveline was not alone because she was loved. Not perfectly, not gently enough, but loved. And if you keep using her death to punish each other, then the last thing she tried to do coming home means nothing." Celeste looked at him through rain and tears. Rosalind's sobs softened into exhausted breaths. An ambulance arrived minutes later, followed by security nurses and a state trooper, but the true emergency had already passed. Back at the estate, Rosalind slept under warm blankets, while a doctor adjusted her medication and spoke quietly with Celeste about care plans, honest communication, and how comfort did not always require feeding a delusion. Nolan waited in the hallway, soaked through, wanting badly to leave before gratitude became money again. Celeste found him near the staircase, holding a towel he had not used. "I listened to the rest of her messages," she said. "Aveline wanted us to sell the East Wing and turn it into a respite home for families dealing with dementia. Mother promised her once, then forgot." Nolan nodded. "Then don't let the promise die with her." Celeste looked toward her mother's room. "I don't know how to be soft." "Nobody does at first," Nolan said. "You practice." She gave a broken laugh. "You make it sound like changing brake pads." "Brake pads are easier. People squeal louder." For the first time, Celeste smiled without armor. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out, no check, no envelope, only a folded paper. "The money I gave you," she said, "keep it. Not because I bought you, because your daughter needed heat, and I should have helped without humiliating you." Nolan's pride rose, but this time it did not rule him. "I'll keep what I used," he said. "The rest goes to that respite home, in Marin's name, if you want to make something decent out of it." Celeste's eyes softened. "Nolan Pierce family room," she said, "with blue dogs on the wall." Nolan almost laughed, and that small sound felt like release. Weeks passed. Rosalind's memory did not magically return, and the Veyne family did not become whole in a single beautiful scene. Some days she still asked for Aveline. Some days she knew Celeste and apologized for teaching her to become a wall. Some days she forgot Nolan entirely, then remembered his hands. Celeste changed unevenly, imperfectly, but truly. She reduced her hours, sat with her mother without a phone, and learned to answer repeated questions as if love mattered more than efficiency. The East Wing became a warm place with sunlight nurses who spoke gently, chairs for exhausted relatives, and one mural of a blue dog with 6 legs, because Marin insisted 4 looked lonely. Nolan's life also did not become a fairy tale. The garage still struggled. Bills still came, and his hands still cracked in winter. But something inside him had settled. He no longer believed dignity meant refusing every hand offered, and he no longer mistook survival for shame. One evening, Celeste came to the garage not in a perfect suit, but in a simple coat carrying takeout for Nolan, Marin, and Owen. Rosalind waited in the car, humming softly, watching Marin tape a drawing to the window. Celeste stood beside Nolan under the buzzing sign of Calder Street Garage and said, My mother asked if the kind mechanic was family. Nolan looked at Marin laughing through the glass at Rosalind, smiling faintly at Celeste, trying every day to become someone less afraid of love. "What did you tell her?" he asked. Celeste's voice was quiet but certain. "I told her family is not always who saves you from the crash. Sometimes it is who stays afterward." Nolan looked at his grease-stained hands, then at the people gathered in the cold light of the garage, and understood the truth of it. Love did not erase loss. Money did not cure guilt. Truth did not always arrive gently. But people could change when they stopped hiding from pain. Families could begin again when someone finally chose honesty over control, and sometimes the poorest man in the room could give the richest family in the city the one thing they had never been able to buy: the courage to come home to each other.